have a conversation that is relevant to our current time and context, trying to recreate an immigration story that happened over 100 years ago. That's not easy.
We carry so much of the past with us, and this story in particular, the trauma that this generation brought with them through their experience, as well as the memories of the golden era that they carried. And so this journey of reliving is an opportunity to explore both sides of that story.
I think for me, it was a trip about faith, about family, and about community, and also about reconciliation.
Surely everyone will be grateful to live in a country where God has so far granted peace, where one can lie down for the night after a day's work without trembling with fear at the thought. Will I and my family also live to see tomorrow? Or will we be swept away by the enemy?
It was a really intriguing and challenging idea to recreate the steps of the Russlaender Mennonite migration that took place over 100 years ago from the Soviet Union to Canada. A chance for us to pause and really show people that this migration meant something. It had repercussions, both positive and negative, throughout Canadian society, and we wanted to investigate that.
So we started in Quebec City on the 6th of July, 2023. And from there, we went to Gros Isle the following day.
Mennonites during this period didn't come all at once. They came in waves between 1923 and 1930. Many passed by Gros Isle on their way to the port in Quebec City, and some had to stop there because of quarantine. So Gros Isle was a logical place to start.
I just thought it would give us a tiny inkling of what it must have felt like for them. As that first group of immigrants, having crossed the Soviet Union, having crossed the Atlantic, what it would feel like, and thinking, oh, this is my brave new world. And how bewildering and how frightening when they had to start with nothing.
The history of the quarantine station here at Gros Isle starts in 1832. This is when the quarantine station will open.
The people who undertook this journey are mostly gone. But through their letters, their photographs, their memoirs, we are able to understand what they went through.
On July 17th, 1924, they saw the skyline of Quebec City, but they were stopped, and about 50 people were removed to be quarantined on an island until their health problems cleared up.
The Mennonites ended up being quarantined before they got on. So there weren't that many of them, people who had to be quarantined. Even amongst the 60 people that were with us, several of them had had relatives who were in quarantine there, measles or something like that. You know, they stripped people, they had to wash their clothing, they had to get into showers. It kind of was grisly. You sure got a feel for what that must have been like.
I think we can learn that understanding this particular group and their particular migration that happened 100 years ago, how it impacts families even today.
Families were separated, and sometimes children were sent with others or came with relatives and not with their own family. It was important for some that they be given that opportunity, a new chance for life in a new country.
Their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren are learning anew about those stories, and they bring that into their own lives.
Okay, so we are now in one of the 3 cemeteries that we have on the island. So we have this.
Helps us, in a broader perspective, understand refugees coming to Canada today.
The reality is that many of us can't comprehend leaving behind our homes, our friends, and our family. But we can try to connect through some tangible physical points, artifacts, buildings, and the skyline that they experienced.
It was on the 17th of July, 1924, when we first set foot on Canadian soil. Although we had entered the harbour of Quebec City the night before, we were told to remain on board our ship, Minnedosa, and sleep the night in our cabins. Next morning, early, we left the ship and were ushered into a huge immigration hall.
Verse 4, we've been.
So some came thinking of this, as they said in their own words, the land of Canaan. Canada sounded like Canaan, the land of freedom, the land of opportunity, in which they could exercise their gifts, their education, and raise their families and their children.
The 1,200 immigrants who gathered there created an impression of utter confusion.
Reporting 735.
As papers and passports of each immigrant were processed.
Embarquement pour Montréal commencé.
Starting the journey from the beginning, from southern Ukraine, a place once again torn by war and violence, was just not practical. So if we want to retrace the journey of this group, starting in Canada on trains was definitely doable. And very much the storyline of the Russlaender.
On the train, we received sandwiches, sausages, etc. It was enough to satisfy our hunger. In fact, I had little hunger because of the uncertain future.
Mennonites have been moving to places all over the world, and the Russlaender are just one of those stories. These groups, originating out of what is now the Netherlands, southern Germany, and Switzerland, shared the Anabaptist principles that emerged from the Reformation.
There's a very important thing which is often missing from Mennonite accounts, and that is context and the wider world that they interacted with in the past. This is a really big story. I mean, you've got to take it right back.
So there is the Protestant Reformation in the 1500s, Martin Luther. And then there is this group of people, sort of centered in Switzerland, who didn't think that had gone far enough.
There were many new and contentious ideas that clashed with the church, but one of the key ones was the rejection of child baptism, that only an adult could commit themselves to God.
And so in 1525, we have that first rebaptism of somebody who had been baptized as an infant, and then gets rebaptized, and you have the birth of Anabaptists. So that's what's called the Radical Reformation.
So the Anabaptist ideas, much to the chagrin of the Catholic Church, spread northward from Switzerland.
And we have two basic groups of Mennonites that arise out of this Radical Reformation. The Swiss Mennonites, who remain centered in Switzerland and South Germany, and then the Dutch Mennonites.
From the Netherlands, which is a sort of swampy backwater, but the Netherlands eventually became probably the richest country in Europe in the 17th, right into the early 18th century. That wealth was based on trade, but they had a background in trade.
Of course, the Mennonite name comes from one of these radicals, the Anabaptist leader Menno Simons, who was a priest in Friesland, modern-day Netherlands. In addition to adult baptism, Mennonite beliefs centered on the idea of a separation between church and state, and also a commitment to nonviolence or pacifism. So there is this natural conflict between Anabaptists and the state, because Anabaptists reject military service and they refuse to take oath to the state.
You know, the Anabaptist was a very theologically oriented disagreement with the Catholic Church and ultimately with the Protestant Church, having not gone far enough.
These convictions place them directly in conflict with European empires, nation-states, and the Pope. The clash leads to persecution. And many will eventually move to Pennsylvania in the early 18th century. And some of that group will move to Ontario, Canada, setting up another stage of this Russlaender story. Of course, the Russlaender migration that our tour retraces is the journey from the Soviet Union into Canada. This story begins with Dutch Mennonites fleeing persecution and settling in Royal Prussia, which is in modern-day Poland.
In the Prussian lowlands, Mennonites become an ethno-religious group. They remain religious in the sense of Protestant and Anabaptist, but they also develop characters of ethnicity.
The Mennonites who went to Danzig originally spoke a sort of Dutch, but they were entering a Low German world. The key to why the Mennonites end up in Danzig lies in the Hanseatic League, which was a major medieval trading link. The language used in trade was Low German. Lautdeutsch to the Mennonites.
So in Prussia, there is a language and cultural shift that takes place.
Now, Mennonites, there's a world of religion and a world of social life. They're not necessarily the same.
Mennonites moved from the Dutch language into German, High German for church services.
They had the Luther Bible now, not in Dutch, but in High German.
And of course, this is all supported by printed Bibles and hymnals in the German language, and Low German in day-to-day life and interaction, sort of economic life.
Mennonites have religion in High German. They have an expanding education thing in High German, and cups of tea and Zwieback in Low German.
So by the late 18th century, their pacifist beliefs come in conflict with Frederick II's militarism. And once again, they move, this time into the Russian Empire, by invitation of Catherine II. Catherine had conquered these lands through war, and she also evicted some of the peoples who were living there. Pushed aside groups like the Tatars, the Nogai, and the Cossacks in order to make way for German-speaking settlers that would then contribute to her agricultural vision of the region, and the German-speaking settlers included Mennonites. So that's how they end up in the Russian Empire. And then over 100 years later, they are on the move once again as they are migrating out of the Soviet Union and coming to Canada.
The area through which our train passed consisted mainly of bush, lakes, and rocks. Hardly ever did we get a glimpse of a nice farm with level land.
As they migrated, Mennonites formed tightly knit communities that were defined by their Anabaptist beliefs, but also by their shared language and shared culture. Music played a central role, as reflected in the tour.
I talked the CPR into sponsoring a whole banquet for 100 Mennonites for the 100th year, and that was really a fun event.
Canadian Pacific Railway, they were instrumental in helping Mennonites come to Canada, in both financing the trek and also organizing the ships and organizing the trains.
We had some spectacular entertainment. Carl Stobie flew in. He was on the violin. Godwin Friesen, who is a national award-winning pianist. And Kara Zweeb came to do some vocals. We had a terrific time.
From Quebec, 2 trains were to take us to Waterloo, Ontario. These were no luxurious passenger cars. Nevertheless, they were much more comfortable than the freight cars which we had occupied when we departed from Russia.
Kitchener-Waterloo is an important stop for many reasons. Some of the Russlaender Mennonites stopped and settled here in southern Ontario.
So it's just on the left, your Bethany Evangelical Mennonite Church, which would have been Mennonite.
But there are Mennonites who migrated way before the Russlaender. These are the Swiss Mennonites who came from Pennsylvania in the late 18th century.
From all over, Mennonites and non-Mennonites had come to Waterloo to witness the arrival of the Russian Mennonites.
So there was a Mennonite community there waiting to receive this group, but in reality, this was the first time they were meeting.
The procession must have been a sorrowful sight to the bystanders, for what they saw was a tired and poor group of people, having experienced civil war, revolution, and a long journey.
The church was too small to accommodate all of us, so they welcomed us in the churchyard. The people were very friendly and good to us. We were given our supper there. Cups were brought in big baskets, and coffee was served from huge milk cans, so we all got some hot coffee to drink.
There's another reason why Kitchener-Waterloo is important to the Russlaender story and our stop. Prior to the migration in the 1920s, when Mennonites in Ukraine were thinking about leaving the Soviet Union, they were in fact banned from entering Canada.
It was against the law for Mennonites to come to Canada because of the events of the First World War.
After the First World War, the Canadian government didn't want German-speaking pacifists that seemed to not want to assimilate into Canadian society.
And the government passes this order in council that says basically Hutterites and Doukhobors and Mennonites are not allowed in the country.
But we have Mackenzie King, a politician who is aspiring to be Prime Minister. Mackenzie King is approached by David Taves and others to rescind this ban on Mennonites. David Taves migrated from Imperial Russia in the late 1800s, and he became one of the most important leaders of the Mennonite community. He is also the head of the Canadian Mennonite Board of Colonization. Mackenzie King, he knows the Mennonites, he grew up near them, he knows people like David Taves, he thinks these are good people, and he believes that they can help Canada in developing their agricultural system.
And Mackenzie King, who wants to win the next election, promises that he will revoke that order if he gets elected. Mackenzie King did win the election and withdrew the order in council.
We should also note that in 1922, he opens up the doors for Mennonites, but then in 1923, he closes the door to Chinese immigration, which is an important part of the story that often doesn't get told. So Mennonites focus on the fact that the doors opened for them, but they neglect the second part of that story, is that it closes for other people, and this is based obviously off of racial prejudice.
We're so pleased to have you here today.
The Brubacher House is an old Swiss Mennonite house. I mean, there's been a Mennonite population in southern Ontario for much longer than the Russlaender.
Although this is a Pennsylvania German Mennonite heritage site, it's very exciting to take part in this in a small way. Yeah, an apple peeler and corer. So the Brubakers, they were primarily apple farmers.
That was sort of trying to show us the various stripes of Mennonite living in that area who were asked to be hosts. Because, you know, this is not just a one-sided story. There were receiving Mennonites and there were coming Mennonites, and they got together because they had to be billeted.
They came with little papers and asked for our names. All 900 of us were to be billeted for the night. The farmers had divided us amongst themselves.
You had a family coming with 7 kids or something. You can't undersell what Mennonites across the country were doing here. And for a whole year, you had to bill it. They, you know, for the most part, were really extending hospitality in a way that I don't think many of us would be able to do today or would even consider doing today.
Something that we can talk about is the contribution of the Russlaender Mennonites and their descendants to Canadian society, and not only in business, education, but also in music and in the arts.
There's really an exceptional collection in Conrad Grebel College, and one of the things I found so interesting was they had a focus on Mennonite art. And, you know, we're used to having very austere churches and not very much decoration. The only art we had room for was music.
So, 4 o'clock, it's fine. Yeah, the one that looks like a castle.
17th century Dutch Mennonites in the Netherlands. That's my expertise, so it all feels like current events to me still here. But this is a piece of art that we start with by Joanne Harder, who is an artist from...
And that was one of the most beautiful things that we saw, and I was really struck by it.
One of the unique connection points on the tour is actually a living one. On the university grounds, there is an oak tree that came from an acorn from the Khortytsa oak in Ukraine.
It had been planted in Toronto by folks who had either brought back or received some seeds. And they knew it was going to become too large for their backyard and their garden. And so they donated it to Grable. It was 10 feet tall at the time.
When they first settled on the Ukrainian lands, they gathered underneath this tree. It gave them shade and shelter. Over time, the Khortytsa oak became a symbol of the community, and it has also been mythologized.
Since my parents come from Khortytsa and sat under the oak, this was also a special or meaningful experience for me to have them.
Khortytsa is the first permanent colony after Catherine's invitation, and Khortytsa and then later Molotchna will branch out across the region.
It was sort of an introduction to this part of Mennonite history.
The tree is a nostalgic symbol, what many consider to be a period known as the Golden Age, a period of peace and prosperity. Before the Golden Age, there was a major transformation that happened in Mennonite communities, and that was the migration of a third of the population out of Imperial Russia to Canada and the United States. And that takes place in the 1870s. And the reason for that migration was that the Russian Empire wanted to introduce conscription into the country and also engage in educational reforms. Not all Mennonites could agree with these changes, and a third of the population left and went to Canada and the United States.
Colonial settler era is just beginning on the Canadian plains and on the American plains. And so there's this attraction of huge amounts of free land. And so those combine to create this migration of the 1870s. But it is the most conservative that choose Canada.
Known as the Canadier, like the Swiss Mennonites in southern Ontario, this group will help set the stage for the later Russlaender migration.
So after 1870s, the Mennonites in Russia face increasing sort of pressure. They become less isolated, you might say.
At the turn of the 20th century, many Mennonites in Ukraine and Russia were succeeding in manufacturing, milling, and also in their agricultural pursuits.
And out of that wealth came the thing that created the wealthy communities and all the institutions.
The economic disparity between Mennonites in the Golden Age and their neighbors had become really drastic. And Mennonites were living in an unreal world.
And it wasn't just on the estates, it's also in the villages. Mennonites would hire Ukrainian workers, they'd hire them as servants in their homes, also to work their land. And so there is a class structure that gets put into place that is unofficial, but everyone feels it.
There is this movement going on, even in the Golden Age, where the wealthy Mennonites are beginning to drift away from bits of the Mennonite world. There are voices which remain silent, of which we don't have record. These are poor Mennonites. They never wrote anything. They're not in the Mennonite histories because the Mennonite histories are dominated by the intelligentsia, the educated, the wealthy, who create a vision of the Golden Age.
The tour was organized into 3 legs. The first leg took us from Quebec City to southern Ontario and then back to Toronto.
We went into Toronto, and our first group of tour participants got off and went home, and a second group got on in Toronto for the big long trip across the Shield to Winnipeg.
In late Imperial Russia, a period that is often referred to as the Golden Age. The tour was about more than just touring things, and we had many presentations and speakers along the way, including guests who gave historical lectures.
I'm presenting is a comic about the history of MCC.
Lots of questions and answers, but no exam, although maybe there should have been. We had to have music to lighten the history lessons.
him above, praise him above, praise him above the heavens.
We had left Halbstadt forever. I have long looked back. It is and stays in the past. It is the homeland that one leaves and one can never find a second one. The devil, the leader of this world, has disturbed everything.
I think it is important to understand sort of just really the less than 10 years that they had lived through prior to coming in the 1920s.
The First World War, Mennonites participate and are actually quite patriotic in supporting the Russian Empire. They are medics on trains, they are donating goods to the war effort, they're donating money. So the war effort affects them less than it's affecting their Ukrainian neighbors who are being conscripted into the army and are fighting.
And the war doesn't go well. The war doesn't go well for Russia at all.
So this is also one of the factors that contributes to the acceleration of negative feelings between Ukrainians and Mennonites during this time.
Now you have a very difficult situation because who's the enemy? The enemy is Austria and Germany. What language do Mennonites speak? German.
The golden age of prosperity and privilege in the Russian Empire comes crashing down with the Bolshevik Revolution in October 1917.
Starts off as a revolution, of course ends up being a civil war.
They have no idea who's in charge anymore. Then the Bolsheviks are trying to establish power. Then they have to make the treaty with the Germans because they can't continue the war effort. There is a brief German occupation in southern Ukraine, and then once they leave, Mennonites are left to defend themselves.
There's anarchy. There are bandits. Makhnov is the famous one, Nestor Makhnov.
Long before the war, the Russian peasant was already casting envious glances at the much more prosperous colonist, who only too often was his employer and master. The situation was even more common in the rest of Russia. The downtrodden masses of Russia were finally no longer willing to bear this affliction. They yearned for rebellion.
That's what led to the collapse. It in fact had started to collapse during the First World War.
So on the one hand, they are victimized intensely because they are being targeted, particularly by the anarchists who want to take their wealth and want to punish them. But then Mennonites, some of them join self-defense units, engage in battle, and others join the White Army. So this is just a time of chaos and limited options.
Absolute turmoil of white armies, red armies, and bandits in between.
The future seemed to us so dark and hopeless. The thought of better times was almost gone, and one asked, is this the end?
So Mennonite villages are occupied by the White Army, the Red Army, and also by the anarchists.
The town was robbed and plundered, many of our acquaintances murdered.
People are being killed, just random.
After some of these occupations, Mennonite women had to be transported en masse in wagons to hospitals to be treated for venereal diseases because they had been raped. And these various groups bring diseases into the villages, and many Mennonites die of typhus.
And the church or the leadership can't really come to terms with it. I mean, there are conferences held about what should be the position. Ultimately, you might say people are left to their own devices. Ethically, it's a real challenge. You're a pacifist, you don't believe in violence. Do you stand by? Once the Civil War is kind of won, by Lenin's Bolshevik Party, you then have, the confiscation of estates, factories, socializing, you might say, industry and land.
Canadian Mennonites start hearing reports from Ukraine, and what they're hearing is not good.
It must have been in the year 1918, or perhaps at the beginning of 1919, that we heard the first news of atrocities in Russia. The war had brought much suffering, the revolution even more. Lenin and Trotsky were in power at the time. Terrible cruelty was attributed to them.
So the Soviets are going to take control of the government, and they're going to take control of the economy. And they are going to start requisitioning grain. They don't know what they're going to do with this grain. A lot of times it just rots. And that, in addition to drought, causes a famine.
The news caused great concern here, and the question in our circles became more and more urgent. What could we do to help?
The Mennonites in Canada and the United States, a mixture of groups that had migrated at different points in time, they come together and decide to send aid.
And they realise there's famine, so they start feeding.
It was not just to the Mennonites, it was also to members of the surrounding community. This marked the beginning of the Mennonite Central Committee.
And very interesting this, they're not keen on immigration. What they're keen on is sending in tractors and rebuilding the food base.
We had gotten through the famine, but the new government that had killed the Tsar and his family was making it hard for us to live with any freedom. Buying and selling became difficult. Paper money became worthless.
Then they realise that the colonies are full of these refugees. The estate owners, the industrialists, the millers, the private landowners. Best thing to do, send them abroad.
You have these same questions arising over and over again as to, what does immigration mean? Is immigration the right decision for me? Should I postpone it? Should I stay here? If I do leave, what are the consequences for myself and my family? These are the same kind of challenges that humans face when they're going through this very traumatic, difficult time in their lives, right? Is do I stay or do I go?
The world you knew is gone.
One thing is certain, the flowering time of the German colonies in Russia is over. The farms are completely ruined. Land, stock and equipment have been taken from the settlers, just the same with factories and other enterprises.
And then, of course, where are they going to go? And the most natural place for those from the Soviet Union is to Canada. It's where their relatives are.
Yes, there are Mennonites that, for religious reasons, for economic reasons, that want to leave. The sooner the better. But there are others that are saying, no, I'm here. This is my country. Yeah, the Bolsheviks aren't perfect, but we can make this work.
But in fact, the emigration had in some ways been not a cross-section of the late Russlaender world. And the reason for this is the land of the colonies was safe, but the land of private ownership, including estates, and the factory owners, their factories were nationalised in a sense. The peasants took back the land, and so the colonies were full of refugees, especially Molochna. The 1923 and 24 emigration from what was then the Soviet Union to Canada was clearing out the refugees.
21,000, or a third of Mennonites in the Soviet Union, decided that they need to leave, and leave now.
In the beginning of the 19th century, they were called to Russia as pioneers. Now their mission there as bearers of civilization is definitely over. And their descendants must again seek a new homeland.
A group of Mennonites that are trying to get people from Russia, from Soviet Union, to come to Canada. At the same time, there's a group of Mennonites who are going to Mexico.
These were the descendants of the Mennonites who had arrived in the 1870s. They were frustrated with the Canadian government over issues of community autonomy, particularly in education and language.
And the pitch that Canadian Mennonites made in order to achieve that is sort of to say, we're not like those people that are going to Mexico.
We will learn the language, we will, be good citizens, unlike the ones that are leaving. With these 6,000 Mennonites migrating to Mexico, new tracts of land are being opened up, and this is causing a problem for the Canadian government that is looking to bolster its agricultural production, and now it's losing agricultural workers to Mexico.
Mackenzie King, he's getting delegations from Canadian Mennonites who are getting letters from the Soviet Union about how terrible it is and are starting to mobilize themselves in some way to try and get the people out.
It's not a bad solution to replace one group of Mennonites with another. Canada once again opens its doors to Mennonite settlers. The Russian Mennonite migration of the 1920s, or the Russlaender migration, begins.
There was fear and trepidation of the people on the train as it stopped just before the border for their exit documents for inspection by Russian officials.
When the train was cleared and crossed the border into Latvia, there was jubilation among the people on the train. When it stopped again a small distance into Latvia, the people poured out of the train and spontaneously burst into a well-known German hymn of thanksgiving. Nun danken wir allen unser Gott. Now thank we all our God.
The ones who survived to come to Canada had lived through horrendous situations. So that's a first point to understand that the Russlaender who came, they brought trauma with them. And that's another lens that I think we're starting to look at their experience more closely, which was revolution, Bolshevik revolution, First World War, civil war in the regions where Mennonites lived in Ukraine.
Those stories haven't been sufficiently told or understood. Starvation, the horror of the Civil War, and killing and abuse that happened.
I always found experiential learning a really good way to hit young people. And I thought, wow, a train trip would be so interesting. It shows you a little bit about how long a journey that might have been. And it's just a little bit because we have way more modern trains. I thought, well, if we want to have the experience, let's do that.
So I was invited to go on the trip because there's a long train with no internet between Toronto and Winnipeg in northern Ontario there, with beautiful scenery, but I think they felt we need some levity.
We just left Toronto. We've gone 8 hours or however long it's been west of Toronto.
So I went on to read and chat with people and stuff like that.
And also when we go from Winnipeg to Steinbach by bus, there's a sign that says "Welcome to the Center of Canada" thing. And when they put up that sign on the highway, I thought, oh, Torontonians are going to be upset with this sign. So I wrote this article, "Toronto Riots After Discovering It's Not the Center of Canada."
I do have a personal connection to the Russlaender story. So my grandfather's own experience coming across Canada on the train in the 1920s. This would kind of reenact in some way, in a more luxurious way.
Counselors, this can't be for real, can it?
But it was really important to have young people there because they're the people who carry this story forward. It's one thing if you were there or you were a child on this trip or you have heard of such a thing before, but it's quite another thing if you're a young person who really has no connection to this story and it makes a story come to life.
And I remember hearing stories about Ukraine from my grandfather who was born there. These would not have necessarily been his own personal memories because he was 5 years old when he moved to Canada, but he would talk about the old country a lot. And so I sort of developed this fascination for, what it would have been like to live there, because he was my connection to where Mennonites used to live.
As immigrants, we had received permission to emigrate to Canada on condition that we would settle on farms. Was it any wonder, after traveling a whole day and seeing nothing but wilderness, rock and lakes, that some of the immigrants became a bit squeamish about their future? Particularly those who had worked the rich soil of the steppes of the Ukraine.
Manitoba is really the first big stop for the Russlaender. Thousands of families set up their homes here. Some will fill spaces left behind by those migrating to Mexico. One of the most important elements is that they need somewhere to go. And southern Manitoba is the destination because that's where other Mennonites are, and those Mennonites can host them.
Good morning and welcome to this centenary conference, the Russlaender Mennonites, War, Dislocation and New Beginnings. We are located on the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation.
We decided to have a conference in the middle of this train trip in which we had academics and writers tell aspects of this Russlaender story. David Bergen is the author of, is it now 11 novels with this new one? Yeah.
There's my father who came from Ukraine and told many stories about his father being a medic in the White Army.
I heard stories from my father who came from Ukraine. He came in 1924, and from other people in the church I grew up in. That definitely shaped me. It gave me a good sense of story.
So what do you think it is about this sort of revolutionary Ukraine that is so intriguing for fictional authors?
It has to do with veracity, seeking after, well, what really happened, and in a novel form, it's a good way to explore it, and that doesn't mean that how we say it happened actually happened that way.
Well, stories are important. Where we come from is important. Our memories are important, even though we might have false memories. But that's important too, to understand what's real, what's not real.
The Steinbach Mennonite Heritage Village was an obvious choice for the tour. They've collected artifacts, even buildings, of Mennonite life in Ukraine and also in Canada.
I here typically see the Russlaender as proud, as arrogant. They're willing to compromise.
Not only that, they put on an exhibit for the Russlaender migration.
Ushering in the migration of 23. So they're entering a situation that is not easy. In Canada, just before the Russlaender arrived,
I came in with a group of people, and I am very claustrophobic. So I was like, I'm just gonna step aside. And then I turned back and I was like, oh my God, my grandma's right there. This is weird. So the story goes that these are friends who were taking a class in sewing for their domestication purposes. And so these are all outfits that they would have put together for themselves. And their teacher was an old spinster lady in the village. It's weird to see a part of your life hanging on a wall, but there it is. There it is. So it's kind of a fun little connection.
The tour was intentionally organized around music and around the idea of singing together, singing as a community, and singing the songs that Mennonites would have sung at that point in time. And so that kind of brought us back to that experience, because along their journey, the Russlander sang these songs. Zangerfest was a tradition of singing festivals in which people would gather together to sing. It's a tradition that they carried to Canada, and we've had Zangerfests throughout this 100-year period, and then we decided to have another one again in Winnipeg.
Because they lost everything, and the only thing they took with them was their voices and their hymnody, that was the way they expressed their emotions. And I think the music is the way they dealt with all that. Nobody had a therapist, right? They sang together.
We serve about over 100 people a month that come looking for information, doing research.
The archives were terrific. I mean, I actually have to show you something from the archives, because
Collecting the story of Mennonites, we collect anything Mennonite that's across the country, interdenominational. The letter of invitation from 1873 from the federal government to the Mennonites to come and settle in Western Canada. So these newspapers provide an important link for people doing research. It's almost like Facebook, because people would write into the newspaper and the newspaper would publish it and everyone could read it. So that way it's kind of like a Mennonite Facebook before there was Facebook. We put out the Mennonite Historian 4 times a year.
The amount of organization that went into bringing Mennonites to Canada, the trains and the ships, all of that needed to be paid for as well. And Mennonites coming from Ukraine and Russia had very little.
Someone was asking me about David Taves' material yesterday. Maybe he's on.
There are many people who contributed to this migration, but there's one person who really stands out, and that's David Taves.
The railroad was very interested in having settlers for across the rail lines. Colonel Dennis was commissioner for the CPR. He was a person who was thought to be sympathetic to Mennonites, saw the first Mennonites come to Manitoba in 1874, observing these people work, and so he had a very good impression of these people. The David Taves' involvement in this story was very significant. He went to Colonel Dennis and said, well, there's trouble in Russia. We'd like to really make sure we get a large migration of people coming through here.
Abram A. Friesen was a delegate that was sent from Ukraine to Canada to help tell the story of what was happening there. And then he becomes the business manager for the Canadian Mennonite Board of Colonization. David Taves, A.A. Friesen struck a deal. Canadian Pacific Railway would advance the money for transportation and the board would guarantee repayment. Basically everything on an IOU.
Your confidence in us stands out as one of the most glorious pages of our history. Never shall we forget. God be with you. The Mennonite settlers.
This is known as the Reiseschuld or travel debt.
The archives were terrific. They had all the records of the Reiseschuld. So I just had them pull for me these records of when people came. And these ledgers were kept for every single passenger that had a travel debt.
It totaled $1.7 million at the time. Some families paid it right away, others struggled. Some congregations stepped in with loans and aid.
Both of my families paid off their travel debts. And some families were so noble as to pay double for people that couldn't.
By 1946, the Reiseschuld was fully repaid to the CPR. This was an achievement that was celebrated within the community as a testament to Mennonite solidarity and also financial discipline. Individual debt, it was treated as a community debt. So people did pay for other people, and some people who weren't even on the journey paid into this.
Gott führt uns an Vaterhänden, schützet uns in Kampf und Streit. Seiner Gnade ist die täglich Kraft und Stärke uns verleiht. Himmelfröhlich, alle Tage Sonnenschein, voller Schönheit verwegtes Leben, fröhlich macht uns immer sein.
For the big long trip across the Shield to Winnipeg, and that part ended in Rostern, Saskatchewan, so would have paralleled the arrival of the first group of immigrants. And we were within a couple of days of the actual arrival date in Rostern.
Today, we at the Station Arts Centre extend a warm welcome to all of you to this historic location where 100 years ago, many of our ancestors terminated their long and harrowing journey from South Russia, or present-day Ukraine.
These are readings from David Taves' memoirs. For those of you who don't know, I am a great-granddaughter of his. So I'm going to take an excerpt from the end of this memoir, which describes this day. At about 5 o'clock in the afternoon, the long train with 10 passenger cars and 3 baggage cars arrived at the station, and 608 immigrants stepped out. A choir of immigrants sang the beautiful song, Gott grüße dich, kein anderer Gruß gleicht dem an Innigkeit. May God greet you, no other greeting is so warm. We were all deeply moved at the sight of those who had suffered starvation and persecution. Once wealthy, they had arrived without means. They sat on their bundles and suitcases and awaited their fate. The task now was to make a fresh start under completely new circumstances.
All the equipment was new. The horses didn't understand Russian. There were no Ukrainians to help with the harvest, even if you could plant anything. They couldn't get maids. In fact, their daughters had to go to Winnipeg to be maids. Can you begin to get an idea of the chaos?
We view this journey as a success. We almost celebrate it, but we forget about all of the pain and suffering that went into that journey and all the struggles that they experienced in order to undertake that journey, the sorrow of leaving behind their homeland, and then having to rebuild their lives.
If you form a circle over here, the people at the back can see. Please open the envelope and put the medallion around your head. In the envelope is a small litany that you will take part in. We want you to take part in that litany because it is the only honor 100 years later that we can bestow on David Taves, who was an important person in the immigration, of course, of Russlaender to Canada.
My mother was on that train, and when they got to Rostern, the only thing she could remember was that they got cookies, which was very special, after they had been eating dried bread. It's so unfortunate that you don't ask the questions that you would like answered now. We should be so thankful that our ancestors saw into the future and realized that they had to leave their country and leave a lot of memories and relatives, belongings behind to start, and they didn't know what they were getting into.
After 1926, the migration continues, but in trickles until 1929. In essence, politics interferes in the migration. Politics on both sides. The willingness of the Soviet government to allow mass migration to continue ends. And the doors close. And we're also moving into a period in which Canadians are less willing to have more people come to their country. So the anti-immigration sentiment is picking up after this period in time as well in Canada. The Russlaender face another crisis in the Great Depression, and they've just arrived, they've just started to establish their lives, but now everything is thrown into chaos because they can't pay back their loans.
To them beginning to doubt whether it was a good move or that they really wanted to become like English.
The Russlaender Mennonites started to experience an unsettling lack of communication with their relatives that did not leave the Soviet Union.
The Russian Revolution and the events afterwards swept away this whole basis of the wealth.
In the late 1920s, you know, when Stalin was starting to coalesce his power, the government is starting to implement all kinds of very harsh policies with respect to dekulakization, removing the wealthier peasants from the countryside, collectivization, agricultural, economic policies that's going to radically change the countryside.
There was a compromise by the Soviets as they tried to reconstruct and rebuild their world. This is called the New Economic Policy. It lasted roughly from about 1923, 1924, through to about 1926, when the Soviets decided to stop compromising and create the Soviet world they wanted.
The best and the ablest were exiled to convict labor in the far north. It is called liquidation of the propertied class as such, that is, exterminated. Those left behind, impoverished, dispossessed, half-starved people were driven together in collectives.
Many people are called, kulaks, enemies of the state. Those labels apply to Mennonites, but they're also called agitators for immigration. They are disloyal.
they can't be trusted, that they are wealthy, that they don't believe in the Soviet system, and that they're a problem that will need to be dealt with.
This new label of agitators for immigration is something that you see very specifically relating to the Mennonites and their past immigration activities.
When and if the great mass of those remaining behind will succeed in following, only God knows.
There was no way all Mennonites were going to be allowed to leave the Soviet Union. There was no way. Despite all the efforts of everyone involved in this migration, there were always going to be people left behind from the outset. And so it was always going to be a partial migration, and in which those left behind now have to deal with this new Soviet system. Many perish. Some escape during and after the Second World War as refugees, and the rest are just left there.
The future is so dark for us. I don't want to think of living through another famine. They say it won't be gradual, but sudden. The people are already buying porridge, but only the collective members can get it.
Grandpa Bergman came to Canada when he was 5 years old in the mid-20s. And my grandmother, who was an aunt, her family came to Canada also around that same time, although she was born in Canada. Really what got me interested in coming on this train trip, because her family came to Canada. But the rest of the aunt's family, in other words, all of her uncles and aunts and so on, stayed in the Soviet Union. We've looked at the KGB files. Her uncles were executed. Her aunts were sent to Siberia. And I just think of, wow, like how different their lives were, you know, experiencing a lot of things that my family, fortunately, didn't experience. So yeah, it means a lot to me that, you know, that my family came to Canada, and I feel very privileged and grateful that they did.
Mennonites have traditionally focused on their own story of salvation, and they've ignored all these other storylines. And one of the most important storylines that they've ignored was the displacement of Indigenous people and their experience of cultural annihilation by the hands of the Canadian government and settlers.
I do think that's very important, that we recognize that there's not just this one story that we can tell, you know, of our ancestors, my grandparents and so on, coming to Canada, but we also have to realize the impact that that had.
Welcome. We're glad to have you here. You're actually standing on what was Stony Knoll First Nation. This was an actual reserve.
The Mennonites around Laird and the Lutherans had acquired or were settled on Young Chipewyan land. And I come from the Muskeg Cree Nation, which is just across the river from Stony Knoll.
It was mapped out, there was boundaries, an actual reservation. And after 1885, descendants scattered. There was a lot of repercussions that you won't find in the history books.
In 1876, we agreed to sit down with the representative from the Crown to talk about a treaty relationship. The treaty was the instrument that had promise for a future. It dealt with the land question, which is what Canada wanted to deal with, but it also dealt with a way of life, how to put food on the table. Because the buffalo were gone, the lack of food, it caused a lot of hardship. There was a lot of starvation between 1876 and the early part of the 20th century. There were all kinds of promises that were made by the federal government. Promises that were never executed properly. Unscrupulous Indian agents who took the land and opened it up for settlement.
In Stony Knoll, we heard about the impact of the displacement of the Young Chipewyan band and how the settlement of Mennonites and other groups of people, how it impacted their communities.
The story of Young Chipewyan is unfortunately a common story, not just around Laird, but in other parts of this province, as far as the land is concerned.
The Mennonites moved into Ukraine and removed the peasants from the land and took over. And then they went to Canada and took over indigenous land, like many settlers did, without sort of acknowledgement of who was there before. And it wasn't just empty land.
That was sort of where we started hitting in Saskatchewan, where we started hitting that theme of reconciliation and what can be managed in the current day, and the work we still have to do, realizing that we displaced people had displaced others, right? That's not something that would have been even in the mindset or dialogue of people of my parents' age.
There's much more recognition of that now, but I don't think there was for many years. It was more in praise of the settler, in praise of the immigrant.
In Alberta, there's another community whose story runs parallel to that of the Mennonites, the Ukrainians. Mennonites and Ukrainians not only share geography, but also cultural touchstones, food, and the rhythm of prairie life.
They're learning about, or in the case like your group today, learning about your own story, about the story of...
You can find yourselves there, right? In different ways, right? It's some of the things that our grandparents brought over.
Cultural influences seeped in, leaving traces of the places and the people that they have lived beside. Inevitably, they absorb and assimilate to varying degrees along the way. The two heritage villages, the Mennonite village in Steinbach and the Ukrainian village in Alberta, are like kissing cousins. Well, maybe second cousins.
So we still have things like Pascha and Vareniki and all these things that we make in a Russian Mennonite family that are colored by, you know, the places and spaces we've lived in. People who were going to Russia or the ones that were coming here and whatever wave it happened that they got here, because sometimes they were cut off, right?
There, back in Russia, we were quite a group, and here we are, only 8 families. There we had a large service, and here we have tiny ones, because there is no preacher here, and we still live somewhat scattered.
The Russlaender couldn't settle in isolated communities any longer, and so they ended up spread out across Canada, scattered in all of these different smaller rural communities.
We are grateful to be allowed to be here in Canada, to be able to live comfortably and in peace, and to have such abundant bread. I think of all our loved ones in distant Russia.
I can't believe, you know, that in such a short time there are generations who really don't get it anymore. And I was hoping that there would be people not only who would remember, but who would maybe stop to think about what it might be like. You have this contrast of, you know, a terrible migration in a lot of ways, very difficult for people to say goodbye to everything and leave everything behind. But they had each other, they had a community. And I think that's what we're losing.
I mean, we joked about it, but we got a slight taste of what our ancestors experienced as we dealt with COVID on the train. Mennonites moved as a community. They were helped along the way by each other because they moved as a group. And when they arrived, they also settled and helped each other as a group. And that cohesiveness, that way of living has really gone out of fashion in our society.
I think part of the inspiration for doing a train tour was to find each other again, was to find a community as we traveled across the country. And then we had to go right back down the Fraser Valley into Abbotsford at the end.
There were 25,000 in total who made the move. Of the 25,000, 4,000 weren't able to come to Canada for several reasons.
And that one was very different. It was sort of northern hemisphere, southern hemisphere, and looked at folk songs from the various countries that Mennonites have journeyed through. So there were some German folk songs, there were Ukrainian folk songs. There were ones from Paraguay, Brazil. It was a very colorful, wonderful, and totally different kind of musical thing at the end. So we did a lot of different things on the music end.
The Sumas First Nation, on whose traditional lands Mennonites settled, are now an important part of the conversation and history being discussed.
In 1924, the government decided to drain Sumas Lake, which was about 30,000 acres, and this gave them 30,000 acres of farmland. It put an end to a way of life that the indigenous people had known thousands of years.
The Mennonites came in there and made big berry farms, big poultry farms, and other things. So they very much benefited from having fantastic farmland in what used to be a lake.
So when we came, we created Yarrow, Arnold, and Greendale, and those were the first 3 Mennonite settlements in what was Sumas Lake.
My grandpa used to say that in the Coast Salish territory, Samath was the central location where the people used to gather. People gathered there from all parts of the Coast Salish nation for the winter ceremonies.
MCC had been working on this with the Abbotsford Museum, had been working on a reconciliation ceremony for years. And a week before the arrival of the train, that thing became a reality. So we were all invited into a longhouse. I've never been into a longhouse before. There was a lot of ceremony involved in it was about 4 hours long, this reconciliation ceremony.
Now, art is used to share stories.
It was humbling. It was a very humbling experience, first of all, for them to invite us into their space, into their longhouse.
As you can see, there's a wolf that's here. The wolf represents our family. It's our family crest.
And for them to share their story with us, and then for us to have the opportunity to admit that we didn't think of them, that in the telling of this history, we have never thought of them, and how now we need to rectify that.
How do we connect people so that they come together and concentrate on what do we have in common? What do we have to work with to build community, to build groupness? You know, you need to keep up with us, you know, in understanding your own history, where you come from, why you're here, who you replaced on this land.
And Harry's going to lead us.
Mennonite Central Committee presented them with a quilt.
We sang to them and they played to us, and we broke the bread together, and we, you know, it was an event.
It would help you go back and dig around in your own history and get a fuller story of who you are so you can share with us who you are.
It replicates the journey. It probably doesn't fully replicate the experience, but I think we still can get a sense of the journey, the distance, for example. Have to entertain ourselves with storytelling, you know, which I maybe assume that they might have done, and music, which I assume they might have done on this long train journey. So in that sense, maybe it is more like our ancestors than I thought at first, you know, with our lovely desserts we had each meal and so on. So.
It was a very complicated tour. It had many different moving parts. It had many ups and downs, just as I'm sure the immigrants coming to Canada also experienced. Bring all of these different elements of the story and add in new elements, and to just focus on what this trip and migration meant.
But our story isn't finished yet, so maybe we'll have some interesting times coming in the future. We don't know.